Welcome everyone to the second session of this webinar. This is the struggles for a more inclusive and participatory UN, what hopes for reforms. I just want to welcome you and thanks to all the panelists from me here. I will let the room to Inés Pousadela, who will be leading and moderating this session. Just a message for our students. Aquellos que están por créditos por conferencia, sepan que tienen que tener su nombre completo, su número de estudiante y las cámaras prendidas para que Bedelia pueda rastrear. Thank you very much, Inés. All yours.
Thank you, Virginia, and welcome everybody to our two-part webinar on democratizing global governance, citizen power in the EU and the UN. And this is the second part of the webinar, which will be focused on ongoing struggles for a more inclusive and participatory UN. In the morning here, we discussed democratic innovations in the European Union and had a bit of a discussion about which of those could be scalable to the global level and how. And now we'll dive headfirst into the conversation about the potential and challenges of global democracy. Basically, we will be looking at a number of civil society visions for UN reform. Basically, the point of departure of this conversation is the acknowledgement that the need for an effective and truly democratic system of global governance has become ever more urgent as global challenges have grown increasingly complex and interconnected. And well, the UN remains the primary forum for international cooperation by its current structure, which has remained largely unchanged since 1945, struggles to meet contemporary demands for inclusivity, accountability, and meaningful participation. So civil society organizations worldwide have been long at the forefront of developing innovative proposals to transform the UN into a more democratic, participatory institution that better reflects the aspirations of the world's peoples, as it's put on the first words of its charter, "We the peoples." So the proposals range from structural reforms of existing bodies to revolutionary ideas for new mechanisms of global citizen participation. So this webinar brings together leading civil society voices to explore concrete proposals for democratizing the UN system. We will examine initiatives such as the creation of a UN Parliamentary Assembly to represent citizens directly, the establishment of a World Citizens Initiative to enable global citizen proposals, and mechanisms to strengthen civil society participation in UN decision-making processes. We will have the opportunity to discuss all of these issues and many more with 5 amazing speakers, whom I'm going to introduce in alphabetical order. So by name, first name, so we'll start with Jesselina Rana. She is a human rights lawyer by training and the UN advisor at Civicus's New York hub, where she leads research and analysis on international law and policy, advocates for meaningful civil society participation at the UN, and advises the UN and member states on global civic space issues. Previously at Amnesty International Nepal, she played a key role in legal reforms on rape law, citizenship laws, and asset violence legislation. Jesselina is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Second, we have Oyebisi Oluseyi. He is the executive director of the Nigeria Network of NGOs, which is a member of the Global Civil Society Network Force. He has a rich background in civil society strengthening, including at UNICEF New York, where he initiated the Rural Voices of Youth initiative. As the co-chair of the Forest Task Force on the Summit of the Future, and with multiple leadership roles across civil society platforms, his experience bridges local initiatives and global policymaking. Then we have Rebecca Schutt. She is the executive director of Citizens for Global Solutions. She is the co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court and co-founder and convener of Impact Coalitions on Just Institutions and the International Court of Justice and International Anti-Corruption Court. She serves on the boards of or advisory committees of several organizations and coalitions, including Integrity Initiatives International, which leads the campaign for an international anti-corruption court, and the Coalition for the United Nations We Need. She's an international lawyer, but before becoming a lawyer, she worked for nearly a decade in international democratic development and thus appreciates intersectionality of democracy, human rights, and law. Then we have Rodrigo Lima. He is a program associate at Democracy Without Borders. He has a master's degree in international development studies from Wageningen, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry, University in the Netherlands, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Universidad de la República in Uruguay. He works on democratic governance, local democracy, public policy, and institutional development. And he recently authored a research brief mapping the proposed mandate of a UN Special Rapporteur on Democracy. And last but not least, we have Sigrid Kroman-Schjoller. She is a policy advisor working on all things UN with global focus, the Danish platform for NGOs that engage in global affairs. For the past 3 years, her main focus has been civil society's participation in UN processes and mainstreaming human rights, from the climate conferences to the Security Council. She has previous experience from the Danish UN mission in New York and UN Women, and holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Copenhagen. So, 5 amazing speakers who will address critical questions about representation, accountability, and participation at the global level, and will hopefully tell us how civil society can build momentum for these reforms and create effective coalitions for change. The panel will have a conversational format. I will ask several rounds of questions to our 5 panelists, and then we'll tackle the questions that we received from you, the audience. So you're all welcome to write your questions in the chat, or otherwise you can wait and take the mic and ask them in the last half hour of the webinar, and then we'll have a discussion. So now, finally, the introduction is over. Let's get started. And let's start with the diagnosis. I have a question for all of you, just to break the ice. What's your vision? How do you view the current situation? Has the UN lived up to its promise? You know, specifically to the promise of the opening words of its charter, "We the peoples"? What have been its main achievements? What are its main shortcomings? What's your response in a nutshell? Who would like to go first? Maybe we'll start with Rebecca, maybe?
Sure, it's a pleasure, and I feel a little bit out of turn with such illustrious fellow panelists speaking first. But if I may, having also been a participant in this Summit of the Future process that just recently, well, I won't say concluded, but we had a summit. It did happen in September of this year, and now we're in the next phase. We've had, I think, a lot of existential thinking about what the UN means, how it can be improved, how permeable, how malleable it is. And I'm reminded that the UN Charter was always meant to be a living document. So in 1945, at the International Conference in San Francisco, where the UN Charter was adopted, then US President Harry Truman said, I'm going to quote here, "This charter will be expanded and improved as time goes on. No one claims that this is now a final or perfect instrument. It has not been poured into any fixed mold. Changing world conditions will require readjustments." And that's what I hope we're here to talk about today, those changing world conditions and the readjustments that are required. At the moment, if I expand on my diagnosis as requested, What I look at with the UN system, any of us who have been through civics class, regardless of your country, usually come across the notion of 3 branches of government to make an operational, accountable, transparent, and effective cohesive system. The UN system, as it currently is written and as it is currently envisioned, is very executive heavy. One might say, I will say, maybe it's a coarse metaphor, that if we look at a 3-legged stool, maybe there are 1.5 legs there. And that's not very structurally sound. And when I say 1.5 legs, I will refer, I think, in later comments to the fact that there are judicial organs within the UN system that are incredibly important, that do very necessary work, but are perhaps underutilized, and that there is no legislative branch. And so with that 3-legged stool imbalance, what we have is an executive that by and large part is not necessarily composed of elected officials, is not necessarily related to the citizens of the globe. And let's also remember that the UN system, as it is currently iterated, has advanced somewhat, but is largely still a product of that 1945 charter, where there were 50 countries present, 4 women, and of course, there was a notion that there is a case of victor's justice in the apparata that were designed coming out of World War II. So I'll leave my diagnosis there, but when I go to, I think, our prognosis, perhaps we have some more room for optimism, because I do think that over the course, especially over the last year or two, actually, of contemplating the Summit of the Future, we have seen the opportunity for discussion of change on a pretty seismic, pretty existential level within the United Nations system. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Let's hear from Rodrigo. What's your diagnosis?
First of all, thank you all for being here, and I do encourage a lot this type of forums for open discussion. This is a very important topic, and as Rebecca said, it has now much more of a particular relevance now after the Summit for the Future. To go in a short answer to the question, has the UN lived up to its promise? Well, I would say that not anymore. It is important, first of all, to recognize that the United Nations has been instrumental in what is promoting international cooperation and fostering collective action in the global sphere. So we should not discredit that. But it's true that at the same time, its democratic deficits have become increasingly evident in recent times in its inability to address today most important global challenges. Here I'm talking most about climate change, pandemics, or global inequality, topics which demand a huge collective action. Yet the United Nations capacity to respond to them is often hindered by structural limitations that belongs to, as Rebecca said, more ancient times, so to say, although, the United Nations is a very modern creation. But it's not, in my opinion, fitting or suitable for the times of today. Well, to enter into some examples of what are these democratic deficits? Well, in the civil society wars, but also in the academy, it has been mentioned, for example, the lack of direct citizen representation, this idea of state-centric model that prioritize governments over citizens, and the absence of mechanism for meaningful citizen participation. I think those 3 for me are the most important democratic deficits that the UN has today. And going forward with my diagnosis, I think that most of these deficits are related to one significant fact, and that is that the General Assembly, the main body of the United Nations, while it is inclusive, represents governments, not individuals, neither citizens. This connection, well, it means that voices of ordinary people, of normal citizens like us, usually remain unheard, and we still bear the consequences, of global decisions. In that sense, I think that the main root of the democratic absence of the United Nations, the democratic deficits of the United Nations, is this absence of a demos at the global level, which undermines the very principle of democracy, that its governance should be of, by, and for the people. From this absence of a demos is what I think is the main root for these democratic deficits, and that's what civil societies nowadays are trying to address. Thanks.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Okay, so we'll see there's lots of deficits to point out, and I guess we'll still have some more that nobody has mentioned, and Jesselina is going to talk to us about. So please, Jesselina, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you to my colleagues. Can you hear me? I'm just checking my microphone. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me here, for having Civicus as part of the panel, and I'm really excited to talk to you more about some of the work that we're doing. But before that, like Ines mentioned, identifying some of the crucial problems before we look at what are the campaigns that we're heading, what are some of the initiatives that we're going forward does become very important. And one of the things when we talk about democratic deficit, when we look at the UN, when we look at the UN Charter and the achievements as well as the gaps, one of the things that we really find out, it's unfortunate that it's such a glaring reality, is the lack of women in positions of decision-making at the UN. And this is despite the fact that the UN has been one of the forerunners to create policies that have been championing women's decision-making, powers women at the forefront of peace and security, at the forefront of parliaments across the world. And we're coming towards 30 years of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which is up for review in March for those of us who are following it. And it's interesting because this idea of women being required to be at the forefront of decision making is itself a solution to democratic deficits that we've identified. When you don't have half the population of the world represented equally, then there is a glaring deficit. But despite the UN being one of the premier bodies to champion these causes, to establish these norms of democracy, to establish these norms of gender equality, in 80 years of its existence, we're still seeing a situation where we have not had a single woman who has been a Secretary General of the United Nations. And that is primarily what my conversation around this today is going to be around. But before we step into some of the initiatives and hoping to unpack that with my colleagues here today, it's interesting to look at what the Charter itself talks about. Ines, you mentioned that the Charter starts with "we the people," but the deficits have been so large, or the working mechanisms have been so have been lacking in transparency to such an extent that sometimes a lot of us joke around the table saying that it's not we the peoples, it's almost like we the heads of state or we the heads of governments. That's actually representing the United Nations, unfortunately, and I know colleagues before me also emphasized on this. But when we look at women's representation, or particularly the appointment of the Secretary General, it's interesting to see that Article 97 of the Charter, which talks about this, very briefly touches on this issue. And this sort of lack of clarity within the Charter has been able to create this mammoth of a concept where civil society has been placed out of it, public has been placed out of it, as you said, demographics of the world have been left out of these conversations. A lot of how the Secretary General is appointed has been through horse trading or backroom deals, where the permanent five hold a lot of power, and those of us from the global south, those of us who belong to gender minorities, are not able to see people like us represented at the forefront, but more so, clarity in how the process is taken forward. So I think it's interesting to look at the charter, like you said, from the angle of we the peoples, but also diagnose some of the challenges within the charter. And you know, I'm really excited to talk more about the potential changes. Is this a living document? What are the changes that civil society is pushing for? And I'm really excited to talk more about, you know, some of the work that's going on to have the next Secretary General as a feminist woman through a transparent and accountable process. Thank you.
Thank you, Giselina. And I like that emphasis, you know, not just any woman, right? We need a feminist woman. And it has to be a woman because the current Secretary General has said for a long time that he's a feminist, but it's a he. So we need a woman and a feminist woman. Yeah, that's a lot to ask. Well, we'll see how it goes. Thank you very much. And then we'll hear from Sigrid. What's your take? What are the main deficits that need to be addressed?
Thank you so much, Ines, and thank you for having me here. So I think it's important to notice that we see this democratic deficit all over the world and at all levels. And I think one of the things that many of the organizations represented here today is also working on is this concept of civic space, so the freedom of speech, assembly, and association. And this is under great pressure worldwide. And Civicus does a really important monitoring of this every year. And in last year, 2023, only 2.1% of the world's population lived in what they call open societies. So obviously, the UN is mirroring the status of the world, and so it's no safe space for democratic governance either. And what we see is a civil society really experience and increase pressure within the UN as well. And this is both when we look at some of the concrete references to the role of civil society and to the role of the peoples within sort of the international frameworks and agreements. But it's also something that we, to a large extent, experience within the halls of the UN. I just returned from COP28 in Azerbaijan, and I think I will speak on this a bit later. But speaking to the Summit of the Future as well, it was very much a closed process this year in terms of what the process was like for civil society when the SDGs were negotiated. So it is a really difficult context at the moment. And I think we, or at least my, in these times where I think the trust and the support for the multilateral system in general is declining, I'm trying to really uphold my beliefs in the UN, because the easy answer, I think, from my side of the table in terms of whether it lived up to its promises would be no. But yesterday, I just heard someone say that working with the UN sometimes feels like banging your head against a wall, but there is really no other walls to bang our heads against at the moment. And I think this is quite a good example of what it feels like working within this institution. And this is why I'm also just really glad to be here today and learn more about the other initiatives, because I think what we're all trying to do is sort of trying to expand the room and within the UN, and trying to figure out how we can make the institution live up to its promise.
Thank you, Sigrid. And it's good that you mentioned COP29. That's quite triggering to me. I mean, there are so many things I don't understand about, the COPs are the climate conferences, right? They're the conference of the parties to the UN framework on climate change, right? So this is a UN conference, and then what's the UN doing, like holding this world conferences in countries with closed civic space, where, I mean, no pressure, the much needed pressure. So state representatives do what they need to do. That needs to come from people mobilizing and speaking out. I mean, people cannot do that in such a place. And it's a climate conference, and this is a petrostate. I mean, what's the point? So, I mean, you will have to talk to us a little bit more about that. I mean, that problem with civic space in UN processes. But before we move on to that, let's hear from Oyebisi. I'm sure you have a lot more to say about the current deficits in global governance democracy.
Yes, thank you so much, Ines. And one needs to also acknowledge that the UN itself has provided some level of global governance. However, that governance may be slow, it may be difficult, but it's all that we have, and that's why we need to reform that. But in reforming that, we have to go by that word, we the people. It shows that civil society organizations are part of that conclave, or that word, we the people. But when you look at what has happened in the last 8 months on the floor of the UN, then you begin to saw what the trends we have seen right from the advent of COVID-19. You begin to see that the space for civil society engagement is shrinking, and there's an increasing call for civil society to, have a space, have an avenue to bring the people's voice to the work of our government representatives. So we seem to have some level of deficit there. And that's why you find that many civil society organizations, along with some friendly governments, have also started working together and discussing around how do we improve civil society engagement, but also ensure that that space is not closed to civil society. It goes what other colleagues may have said around ensuring that we now bring some gender dynamics to the leadership of the UN, or that we now ensure that civic space itself is open. All of that shows the need for us to have an institution that can serve as best practices, or that can serve as a model for other governments to look at. So if, for instance, the government of XYZ country decides to shrink or reduce civil society participation at the national level, who do we report to? If the UN itself doesn't serve as that leader or that model that we can all, look towards or look forward to as an example of how to get civil society included in global governance, and not in a tokenistic manner, in a way that is effective.
Well, many thanks for that reminder that we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, we need to reform the UN, not blow it up. Actually, the enemies of the UN are our enemies too. I mean, because those are the people who actually don't want multilateralism, right? We just do want a multilateral system that works, and that works for the people. So definitely what we're looking at is reform. And I also welcome your reminder that we are not just talking about civil society initiatives. We are talking and need to talk about friendly governments, because we need them. We need those, and we need more of those if we want these initiatives to actually move forward. So let's move on to the ideas that civil society has to tackle some of these deficits that you have mentioned. Civil society has a lot of ideas, actually, and we need to hear them, because that's what most states haven't been doing. They haven't been listening. Some of these proposals are quite old, and we have reiterated them for a long time. So, but what are these? How can these deficits be addressed? Let's go in the reverse order. Let's start with the last speaker of the first round. So, Evisi, we want to hear from you first, specifically about civil society proposals to increase civil society access to UN processes.
Yes, I think part of what is happening at this time is, the work that we're doing with the friendly governments that I've mentioned in a campaign that is called UN Unmute, civil society, where you find the government of Denmark and Costa Rica working with the likes of Civicals for Us and UN Foundation to create a manual that can help member states, private sector and civil society as well, to ensure that civil society is more engaged in the UN processes. And in that manual itself, you see some level of recommendations. For example, Canada, during one of their UN engagements, ensured that civil society leaders were part of the government delegation, and they could access many of those meetings where they can, provide context from lived and learned experience from people on the ground. We do also have that very strong proposal, which I think we all need to rally around, of having a UN envoy, a UN civil society envoy that can help create that space for civil society's voice to be heard. And we have important lessons
I think you're breaking up. Honestly, I don't know if anybody else is having problems. Yeah, he's frozen, right? Okay, yeah, he frozen. I think he disappeared now. Oh no, he's still there. Hi, Lucy. You
sorry,
left us for a second. Yeah. Okay, you're back. No problem.
Yeah,
Please go
thanks. I
ahead.
had technology glitch. So, and you know, just to round that up is to say that we have experiences that we've learned in terms of the UN Youth Envoy that we have at this time, who's provided that avenue for the UN to be inclusive and to bring the voices of young people into decisions and also to shape global governance, as it were. I do think that, you know, that proposal for us to have a UN civil society envoy is one that would continue to help us in opening up the UN for civil society, but also there are conversations also on the need to provide that infrastructure for small civil society organizations to also be able to participate from developing countries, from providing funding for them to be able to participate, but also more importantly, ensuring that we can solve problems around visa, which sometimes prevent civil society organizations from third world or developing economies to be able to participate in those processes. So these are concrete proposals that we're seeing, but the major ones would be that on-mute manual, which is still at the draft form, and also the proposal for a UN civil society envoy. Over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. So could you go a little bit into more detail? Do you have any idea what the manual is going to say, or what it says in the draft form? What are the main recommendations, or also a little bit more about, you know, the functions, the roles that this envoy would have, and how it would? It sounds like a huge, I mean, streamlined civil society participation through the UN, which is not an organization; it's this whole system, right? It's huge. It looks like a really big job for one person. What would the envoy have to do to make this happen?
So part of the recommendations that we have in the manual itself has to do with how there's a need for us to streamline and also simplify, but also expedite the accreditation process. There's the other part where I spoke about the financial assistance for civil society organizations to be able to participate. Also looking at the need for capacity development programs for civil society organizations to understand UN processes and to see how they can engage with that. It also speaks to how we can leverage technology and digital platforms in instances where we need to have hybrid systems for some of these meetings, whether formal or informal dialogues, while also looking at how do we improve the communication channels between the UN and civil society organizations. And that's why you find those recommendations around ensuring that we have that UN envoy system that helps us to, you know, manage that information very well. There's also the conversation around how to facilitate the visa process for civil society representatives, and also how to ensure that we can get the UN to build trust and also become more open to civil society organizations. The conversations around diversity, equity, and representation also comes out strongly in the document itself. Then there are a lot of recommendations as to how member states can do this. But again, each of those recommendations speaks to those broader themes that I've mentioned. And in that document itself, you'd also see case studies of what other governments have done in terms of some of those areas that we mentioned, and how those best practices or those examples or those case studies can help to ensure that civil society is able to participate. So there's recommendation for civil society organizations, there's a recommendation for member states, and also there's recommendation also for the UN itself on how best, you know, to ensure that this happens in real time. Don't forget that I've also mentioned that this is in the draft form, and it's still going to a lot of reviews, but I must mention that the first level of recommendations that helped in developing this document came as a result of what happened during COVID, where civil society organizations could not access the UN as it should. And there was a statement issued where about 57 member states supported those recommendations, and those are what we now fleshed or have been fleshed into what we call the Unmute Manual itself.
Thank you, Oluseyi. And we also have Sigrid, who has been involved in the Unmute Civil Society Initiative. Maybe you could also follow up and walk us through these recommendations with concrete examples of what Unmute is trying to do and what it has achieved. What actually has been implemented or what is being implemented from the recommendations that Unmute is making.
Thank you. Yeah, I think OEBC covered it well, but I will try to elaborate a bit because Global Focus, along with a wide range of organizations, was part of the coalition from the beginning, the Unmute Civil Society Coalition. So as OEBC mentioned, it really started in 2020 as a response to the shrinking civic space and the really reduced opportunities for dialogue at the UN, which came as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So again, led by Denmark and Costa Rica, it's a really strong multi-stakeholder coalition, which I think is really one of the big wins as well, talking about how we come across these democratic deficits within the UN. So there's five key recommendations, part of the Unmute Civil Society Initiative. And the first one is that it should maximize the opportunities of digitalization within the UN meetings and processes. And this is something that we saw during COVID, but we're trying to really make use of that and see if we can have more hybrid meetings, and that way broadening the representation of civil society that can't necessarily be present physically in New York, for example. And this also speaks to the second recommendation of bridging the digital divide, which is also something that was very much discussed during Summit of the Future. Then we have the third recommendation, which is to ensure meaningful and inclusive participation at all stages of the UN meetings and at all stages of the general processes. So this is where some of OEBC's concrete recommendations also comes into the picture. And then there is the recommendation on creating a special envoy for civil society. And then the last one on having a dedicated annual civil society action day that could be in the margins of the high-level political forum each summer, focusing on the SDGs, or it could be at the General Assembly. So really have a space where civil society can come together in the margins of the UN. And so these recommendations have been endorsed by 52 member states and more than 300 civil society organizations. And I think since 2020, there's been really a lot of activities around this initiative. There has been a number of side events focusing on this, high-level meetings. OEBC mentioned one of the best practices, that is different countries, Canada, but also Denmark, having earmarked spots in national delegations for civil society. Perhaps someone is not muted.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. If someone,
thank you.
Yeah,
I think it works. Perfect, thank you. I think there's also a really good example of a UN country office sharing their internet connection with local civil society so that they would be able to come to their office and attend UN meetings. So there has been quite a few good examples. And I think what we're trying to do now with the manual is to really show these concrete examples to a wide range of member states in order for them to implement them and bring it all the way into the system. So this is supposed to be really from A to Z in these kind of processes. So the manual is based on virtual and in-person consultations with a wide range of civil society. And some of the recommendations that OEBC mentioned are in the draft manual. They're very concrete, speaking to translation, for example, or accreditation or funding and stuff like that. But I also think what's important in the manual is that we also speak to the more structural problems of the shrinking civic space within the UN. So speaking really to its accountability as well. So this includes, for example, ensuring that civil society can participate in these meetings in a free and safe manner without fearing reprisals, for example, or undue restrictions after they attended these kind of meetings. This is to ensure that there's a proper follow-up and agreed actions or commitments from member states, from the UN. So again, speaking to accountability. And I think this is one of the ways that we can really improve this kind of participation, so that we both have these, the manual both include these very concrete suggestions, which I will say is also maybe a bit less political and quote unquote easier for member states to implement. And then we have these, we try to tackle some of the more like the root causes to the democratic deficits, to the shrinking civic space. And I think this is, if I myself should say it, quite a clever way to go about bringing these initiatives forward.
Thank you, Sigrid. And let's ask Jesselina a couple of questions about to follow up on what she said. Jesselina, you mentioned some deficits that seem to indicate that the problem begins at the top. So how is civil society working to change this? We would like to know not just about the current campaign, 1 for 8 billion, that's the name of the campaign, but also about its predecessor, 1 for 7 billion. I mean, it happened a few years ago, because in the meantime, the world population went from 7 billion to 8 billion. We have 1 more billion people now to be accountable to. That's a lot. So what did the first campaign achieve? What objectives remain unfulfilled? And what is the new campaign trying to achieve?
Thanks, Inez. Yes, it is a predecessor of a much, I would say, 1 billion less people, but it's interesting because, you know, the 1 for 7 billion campaign happened around 2013, 14, 15, 16. And we've had the current Secretary General hold office for 2 terms. So that's essentially why the campaign took form first, you know, during a much smaller population, I would say. But just coming back to, you know, the challenges you mentioned and the challenges at the top. So I briefly touched upon it during the first questions that you had inquired about. And just looking at the charter, so like I mentioned, you know, there's one specific article in the charter that talks about the appointment of the Secretary General, and the process from that, or from the lack of clarity in that particular provision, has been, you know, largely, you know, the Security Council selects a person and the General Assembly sort of puts a rubber stamp, which is an unfortunate reality of how, you know, the selection of the highest level of decision making is being made at the UN without lists of qualifications, without member states being open about who they are recommending to the Security Council, how the Security Council is taking these decisions, who even is the person that we are hoping to see at the top, right? So I think these were some of the key concerns that a group of civil society organizations identified ahead of this particular Secretary General's appointment. And what was interesting was that campaign, which is now a sort of a predecessor of our current campaign called the 1 for 7 billion campaign, brought about some important changes. So like I mentioned, there was a lot of work being done by civil society organizations with member states. And I think this is something important to identify, is that, you know, despite being democratic deficits, like colleagues earlier mentioned, we want to reform multilateralism by making sure that it is a multi-stakeholder process. And what we were really able to do, Civicus was part of the campaign as a supporter, but at the moment for the 1 for 8 billion campaign, we are one of the steering committee members. But for the 1 for 7 billion campaign, it was completely civil society led, along with member states who were able to bring about important changes to the process, including, so the campaign initially requested for making sure that there is, or not even requested, suggested and recommended urgently that the process should include lists of who is being nominated from each country. There should be open calls made by member states before they even choose their candidate that they are going to be appointing. That the list, once the PGA sort of has that list of people that, you know, through qualifications has been nominated, these people are able to converse with civil society organizations, have that reach with people all over the globe that they are sort of going to govern, to make sure that we are aware of the process. And it also recommended for more transparency and accountability. Now, these do build on, some of these recommendations do build on resolutions that have come out in the past. There have been multiple resolutions that look at reworking the nomination and the appointment process. And in 1997, for example, there was a General Assembly resolution that said due regard must be given to gender and geography. Now, this due regard term, even though it's been part and parcel of the process for over 30 years now, hasn't really made that change that we were looking to see. And the 1 for 8 billion sort of learned from some of our challenges in the 1 for 7 billion and is really trying to push that forward. So we realized that, if we do work with member states, the UK was a very important sort of contender for us to work with, especially as part of their Power and Security Council and how they're able to mold conversation and narratives. We really work with them to say that, we need some accountability and transparency in the process. And in the 1 for 7 billion campaign, we were really focused on the process only and less so on the candidates in terms of gender parity. And this is a challenge that I think a lot of us have recognized that, without the push, without what most, countries like to call as affirmative action, it's very difficult to break the glass ceiling. And with the 1 for 8 billion campaign, we're going a step forward. We're, yes, still mandating and still suggesting that all of these processes be transparent, accountable, rigorous, but also we are recommending that now is the time to have a woman secretary general on board. We're working with member states to say that you should only be putting up a woman secretary general, a feminist woman, as a nominee. But then again, we're also, clarifying and saying that we don't want this to be another sort of idea around tokenism. We want to make sure that you are transparent with your process. You are putting up a person who fills in the qualifications that we have established through this process. So the 1 for 8 billion campaign really is trying to create an open race for the Secretary General, who is now going to be appointed soon. And for the next year or two, that is sort of the vision that the 1 for 8 billion campaign is taking forward with civil society organizations and with member states alike. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesselina. And later on, I would like to, all of you actually, to speak about how all of these reforms would fit together, right? Because it sounds like if any of these reforms was undertaken on its own, then, I mean, it wouldn't change much, right? Because imagine you put a feminist woman at the top of this gigantic bureaucratic machine where there's no access for civil society, and that person wouldn't be able to do anything, right? So let's think a little bit further along the road. How do all these reforms work together? But before we do that, let's keep moving on through the other initiatives. And it seems that while Jesselina, you were pointing at a problem at the top, that's not the only problem, because we also have problems at the bottom, right? And Rodrigo, you specifically mentioned the lack of mechanism for direct citizen participation. So bottom-up mechanisms. Would you walk us through the idea of a UN World Citizen Initiative? You mentioned that this draws from inspiration from the European experience. So if you could tell us a little bit about how that works and how would this work at the global level, that would be great.
Yes, of course. Well, the Global Citizens Initiative is an initiative that specifically focuses on this democratic deficit, that is the lack of citizen participation and mechanism of citizen participation within the United Nations. And well, to speak about the initiative, it's a joint initiative of Democracy Without Borders, Civicus, and Democracy International that also is supported and endorsed by multiple civil society organizations and NGOs. And well, as I said, it aims to offer a solution to this deficit by creating a channel for direct citizen engagement. As you said, the words citizens initiatives gets its inspiration in the European Citizens Initiative that well maybe was addressed before in the panel before this, but basically just to give a quick look to for other people and for newcomers. The European Citizens Initiatives allow EU citizens, European citizens, to present to the European Commission a new legislation or a new proposal to be treated by the Commission. Yes, this initiative or this proposal should gather around, if I remember correctly, at least 1 million signatures from European citizens and from at least I think 7 European members. Yes, thank you, Ines. But well, this is the starting point of the World Citizens Initiative, and well, it basically drags this and tries to put it into a global scenario in which allows global citizens to gather signatures and place issues of transnational importance, issues that are globally relevant on the UN's agenda. To enter more into this and to the process, how would this initiative work? Well, the World Citizens Initiative will function through a 3-step process. This is first, the first step is the creation of a geographically representative committee that is it's composed by 10 members from all around the world, that they try to represent more accurately the demography of the humankind and the demography of the world. And this committee will register a proposal or an initiative by drafting a resolution that it aligns with the UN Charter and the UN requirement and specificities. Then, well, this proposal will be checked administratively and trying to follow the requirements and compliance with the procedures according to the UN. And well, then it goes to a second stage. This second stage it could be called more like the support collective phase, support collection phase, that will try to collect around 5 million signatures. This proposal will try to collect 5 million signatures from at least 10 United Nations member states that will contribute to the support of this proposal, this hypothetical proposal. Now, finally, once this hypothetical proposal, this hypothetical initiative gathers that support, let's assume that support is achieved, well, the proposal then would be automatically added to the agenda of a pertinent or a relevant United Nations body, let's say the General Assembly or the Security Council. When then this relevant United Nations body would then be obliged to debate the issue, to draft a resolution on the issue, and to vote on the issue. And it would also allow representatives of the proposal to take the floor and make the case of the initiative, like argument in favor of why this initiative should be approved. And in addition, each member state would also be required to publish an explanation of their votes, so yes or no, to promote transparency with the civil society. The idea behind this proposal, the World Civil Initiative, is to ensure that the voices of what I said before, ordinary people, normal people, and citizens all around the world can influence discussions on relevant matters like climate policy or global health crisis or global inequality. And so it will enable citizens to bypass this state-centric model that is now the core of the United Nations, and and so it would make the United Nations more inclusive, more representative, more transparent, and more responsive to the demands of the citizens around the world. And well, in sum, it would make the United Nations more democratic. That is the ultimate goal of the World Citizens Initiative.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Okay, we'll talk later about how close or how far we are of achieving each of these initiatives. But before that, there's yet another proposal that seems to be more about, I think, more about representation than about participation, which is the idea of a UN Parliamentary Assembly. We'll ask Rebecca to talk to us about it, because I mean, you mentioned that the structure of the UN is this malfunctioning stool with 1.5 legs. I mean, you cannot sit on it, right? Actually, so it has one long leg, that's the executive. It has half a leg, that's the judiciary, right? And then we have no legislative branch. So can you tell us about this intriguing idea of a world parliament? How would that work? How would people vote? And what system would be used? I mean, how? Considering also that there's countries that account for like 1/5 of the world's population, how would that work? Just could you just tell us a little bit about it? It's quite intriguing.
Thank you so much, Inez. If I could step out of turn and just quickly respond to some of the excellent points raised by fellow panelists. Firstly, I just want to highlight in the context of the 1 for 8 billion campaign and the need for a woman, a feminist woman, to lead the United Nations system. This is the 125th anniversary of the first Hague Peace Conference. At that peace conference, there was a woman named Bertha van Suttner who would go on to be the first first woman Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and she was barred from attending that conference. She set up shop across the street from the Peace Palace and had her own salon, and led to some of the most seminal changes that came out. And I can offer some information on that if it's helpful. And then on the Summit of the Future, I don't know if it would be helpful to zoom out a little bit and give perspective on exactly how civil society was able to participate, how we were excluded at times, and what ultimate outcomes were both generated by states parties, the 3 main outcomes, the Pact for the Future, the Declaration on Future Generations, and the Global Digital Compact, but also the People's Pact for the Future and the impact coalitions that civil society led. So I hope we have time to get back to that. But onto your question, not to hem and haw. More than 10 years ago, I think 12 years ago, I was part of an exercise that was called the First Global Parliamentary Report that sought to chart where the legislative institution is worldwide, in democracies and non-democracies, across as many jurisdictions as we could. And in the opening remarks, in the preface, to that document, which I just recently revisited, Her Excellency Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, said that parliaments are the indispensable institutions of representative democracies around the world. Whatever their country-specific rules, their role remains the same: to represent the people and ensure that public policy is informed by the citizens on whose lives they impact. So when we talk about this at a global level, we're actually not talking about anything new. This idea of establishing a second chamber of the United Nations has existed since the organization's inception. In fact, it probably predates it, because I believe the League of Nations, there was discussion over whether or not to add a People's Assembly or a Parliamentary Assembly within the initial organizational structure. So, as an additional body to the UN Parliamentary Assembly would directly represent the world's citizens and not governments. And so therefore, and very much picking up on some of the themes that Rodrigo just discussed. So this would be complementary to the general organs, principal organs of the United Nations. It's Security Council, the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, as well as the judicial institutions. And I would like to also circle back to that leg of the stool in a minute. And so the way that the Parliamentary Assembly is envisioned is an incremental process that at first, initially, UNPA members could come from national parliaments, and in the long run, they should all be directly elected. Likewise, initially, this body could have a consultative role before growing into a larger legislative lawmaking body with the functions that we know of parliaments, which include representation, legislation, and oversight. And in some cases, budgetary capacity is delineated from those three core. I am not the best person to expound at great length. For that, you would go to the director and founder of Democracy Without Borders, Andreas Baumel, who has a wonderful webinar that goes into really, really deep nitty-gritty on the UNPA and how you can join. But I will say that at this point, there are individuals from more than 150 countries, 1,600 current and former members of parliament, and numerous distinguished personalities who support us. And I just, again, I'm sorry for quoting so often. I didn't realize I was going to be doing this in my remarks. But former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali even supports this and says that it's one of the 3 demands of the We the People's campaign for inclusive global governance. I would say that an incremental approach to a UN Parliamentary Assembly, wherein it takes on greater powers over time, is not a far off or quixotic goal. And we've also, I mean, we can look to the European Parliament for a very good example of how powers evolved over time. But without the recognition of the centrality of the legislative body to governance, in my constitution, whatever its democratic value right now, and in many constitutions, the legislative branch is the first article before the executive. And here we do have to retrofit a little bit, but we have an opportunity to do that. And when we have seen such support, including by powers that be, for this incremental approach to a UN Parliamentary Assembly, I am given hope. So that was for the optimistic part of my prognosis.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I have another question for you, because the deficits you mentioned at the beginning suggested the need not just to introduce new mechanisms or institutions, but also the need to reform existing UN founding documents and governance bodies. And you mentioned specifically the Security Council. And that's a sort of I don't know, a trick, difficult, very difficult question. So would you tell us a bit about the proposed reforms to the UN Security Council, and specifically the veto power and the power of the 5 permanent members and so on?
Absolutely. So here's where I think the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future also give a little bit of an aperture, perhaps not an answer, but an aperture for reform and for advancement. So of the 56 actions that states committed to in the Pact for the Future is revisiting the Security Council. Doesn't say how, doesn't say when, doesn't say where, why, in what regard, but opens that up. And through this dialogic process, we were able, as civil society, to engage with states, I think, in a pretty profound way around these issues. I think the first time I spoke on the issue of Security Council reform and the setting of the Summit of the Future was alongside the permanent representative of Namibia to the United States last year at something called the Academic Council to the United Nations System. And at that point, it wasn't clear that he was going to be named to be the focal point for the Pact of the Future. And I did not know until 5 minutes beforehand that I would be seated next to him, talking with him as I, as a civil society member, stress the need for reform. But I was quite surprised, and I also didn't know the speaking order, so I wasn't sure if I was going to directly contradict a member state. I was very surprised by how that conversation went, and that the openness was there on all sides to look at Security Council reform. And I should say that we often, when we look at the executive branch of this three-legged stool, we frequently only concentrate on the Security Council for very good reason. It dominates attention, but there are also probably General Assembly reforms that could take a whole semester to cover that we won't go into today. Much of the conversation on the Security Council reform has obviously centered around its composition in terms of its makeup, how many states, how many permanent members, from abolishing permanent members altogether to increasing the number of permanent members. And here there are several proposals on the table, but something quite important happened around this year's UNGA, the UN General Assembly, timed with the Summit of the Future, which was that states in the P5 began to endorse the proposals for different composition. For example, my country, the United States, is now in favor, under this administration, of adding 2 permanent seats for from the African continent. And that is the AU's, the African Union's minimus position. And then there are also proposals on the table for adding seats from other geographically underrepresented regions, or maybe I should say regions that have profound concerns and that are not necessarily always rotated in, such as small island and developing state SIDS. There are a few other proposals, one by the G4 of expanding the UN Security Council to 25 members, and one by another consensus group on adding a different composition of new members. But beyond these, just looking at the composition of the Security Council, this veto issue looms large, and I will speak for myself and no other organization when I say I do not think we can look at democratic governance on a global scale with the veto power as it is currently iterated. But here again, there have been both recent gains and proposals on the table. So in terms of the recent gains, I don't think it could be understated how important it is that there is now a mandate that there is a General Assembly debate every time the veto is used. So you can't just, so this is UN General Assembly Resolution 76262, which was introduced by Liechtenstein. And so now you can't just veto and then go back in the shadows and not face the rest of the member states. Has that yet led to the veto not being used in awful situations? No, it has not. And this is where some other proposals come into play. There is a proposal launched by the Accountability, Coherence, and Transparency Group on a code of conduct regarding Security Council action, which calls upon UNSC members, both permanent and elected, to not vote on any credible draft resolution intended to prevent or halt mass atrocities. And I believe this is now up to 123 UN member states that endorse. And there is likewise an initiative led by France and Mexico that would seek to underscore what is already in the UN Charter, that a state party to a conflict cannot exercise its veto power. That has obviously not been the case in recent memory. So we do see, in my at least from my perspective, some viable alternatives to the status quo. And I know I've spoken for quite a bit, but I could also address the issue of the judiciary and lack of the accountability gap and lack of implementation, sometimes due to lack of state cooperation.
If you want to do it now, please go ahead.
Okay, sure. So with regards to the judicial branch, if we look at it that way, of global governance, the International Court of Justice is the foundational organ that is envisioned by the UN Charter as the means for the pacific resolution of disputes. And when I find cause for optimism, and I think it might have been Rodrigo or somebody said this earlier, 1945 actually in human history is pretty recent. And until the 20th century, we did not actually have the expectation that disputes should be resolved pacifically, that we should not resort to conflict in the first instance. I mentioned the Hague Peace Conferences earlier, which were seminal to charting out the course of international humanitarian law, or the law of war, although, of course, the 20th century and now the 21st would go on to be quite bellicose. The International Court of Justice currently is only has 74 states accepting its compulsory jurisdiction. And this limits how it can be involved in dispute resolution. It currently is seized of an unprecedented number of cases, I think about 24 of 125 over the since 1947. So that's quite a lot over comparatively in terms of its workload. But many of those come from treaty law and the notion of what's called a compromissory clause, where the ICJ will be the method of dispute resolution. And they do not come from the notion of states accepting that in all cases where they have a dispute, or all cases where they have a problem with one another, that they will resort to this court as the means to resolve it. So we currently have a campaign called Legal Alternatives to War to address this fact. And this is supported and working in tandem with an impact coalition. About 20 impact coalitions were formed in the road to the Summit of the Future from civil society, many of which came to fruition or coalesced at the May Civil Society Conference in Nairobi. And so this coalition seeks to support the International Court of Justice. And another court that you've heard a lot about that has been an integral part of the UN system, that has been in the news quite a bit recently, is the International Criminal Court. And here we have 124, soon to be 125 member states that have accepted the court's jurisdiction over 4 key crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some cases, the crime of aggression, with an asterisk there. But that until that number is the totality of the UN member states, we cannot have the expectation of never again and an end to impunity for the most heinous crimes that can be contemplated by humanity. And here we have very serious and troubling instances of state non-cooperation. For instance, where an individual with an arrest warrant, President Putin, has recently traveled to a member state of the ICC and was not arrested, as they had an obligation to do. We have a very serious incident where the UN Secretary General met with the same indictee, President Putin, which was not deemed by many in civil society to be an essential interaction. And then, of course, we have threats on the court and on both courts really, by outside actors, including the threat of sanctions that has been posed by the United States on the ICC, the United States being a non-member state. So that is a little bit of the judicial side and where it has fallen short. At the same time, there are remarkable successes. I will be in The Hague next week where the first ever advisory opinion on the obligations of states with regards to climate change is going to be, there are going to be oral hearings on that subject before the ICJ. And we also have other tribunals, such as the International Tribunal in the Law of the Sea, which has released very important jurisprudence on issues related to climate change, et cetera. So that, in a nutshell, maybe it's a big nut, it's a macadamia nut, not the smallest nut, but is an overview of the judicial side of the UN system and where it has succeeded and perhaps where there might be shortcomings.
Well, thank you for bringing the judicial branch into to our attention. That wasn't, we know there are civil society campaigns also around the ICJ and the ICC, and but yeah, we hadn't mentioned them so far. So well, thank you. And well, I have a quick round of questions. I got a couple of quick rounds of questions for all of you about this, all of these campaigns and the state of these campaigns around every one of these proposals. So, what is the situation? For example, some of you have already mentioned that although the initiative in all of these campaigns comes from civil society, many of these are also coalitions that include state actors. Which of these campaigns have more support? Who supports them? Who doesn't support them? How feasible are each of these proposals? How advanced are the campaigns? How close are they to achieving their goals? And maybe you can also mention, because it was already mentioned a few times, the Summit of the Future. And I know for many of us, it was, we were hopeful that it could be groundbreaking, that it could actually make a difference, but it was a little bit disappointing, at least from my perspective, but maybe you think otherwise. So maybe you can also mention, what you think about the summit. Was it a missed opportunity? Is there anything that happened there that actually can make us feel more hopeful for the future of these campaigns? So I don't know who wants to go first, but you're welcome to just jump in. Say yes, please.
Yes, I think for the Unmute Civil Society campaign, it's interesting to see how we've had the leadership of Denmark, the governments of Denmark and Costa Rica, along with civil society themselves, plus also how we've had different, retired diplomats and other governments, endorsing this campaign itself. But the beauty of this as well is the fact that we are progressing from talking to now having a concrete tool for the UN to be able to implement some of those recommendations that we may have made, whether at the civil society conference in Kenya or during the Summit of the Future, where we had side events looking at how to ensure that civil society is not muted, including some of the back-end happenings that we saw with some governments making statements on the floor of the UN, which we call anti-civil society statement on why civil society space should be shrunk. And now we've also seen some matured democracies really defending the space for civil society up until the last day when the Summit of the Future declarations will be signed. So this gives us hope that even though we may not be in the room most times at the UN, we still have some friendly governments that are happy to defend that space and that are also putting, both their diplomatic, their, financial resources to ensure that we can continue to have a UN that is civil society friendly or that is civil society compliant, including how, again, as civil society, we are also keeping the momentum. We do agree that this is a niche area, for lack of better word, where you don't have as many civil society organizations coming to join your campaign. However, the few that may have joined at this time shows how important this is. And we do agree on the organic nature of some of these campaigns that, people start joining, some fall off. But at the end of the day, the message is clear. We need a space for civil society within the UN, because the UN serves as that mechanism for global governance, and it provides us that model for us to be able to hold our governments accountable when they are not creating more spaces for us as civil society. Over to you.
Thank you, and it's good that you started. You came first, because I wonder, the proposal of a civil society envoy, right? It looks like of all of these initiatives, it's the most modest one. It seems pretty simple. I mean, I am not maybe I'm ignorant of the procedures, but I would imagine that the Secretary General could appoint an envoy. So, I mean, it's not like creating a world parliament, right? So why we still don't have a civil society envoy?
Comes with the push and pull of, working in a system like the UN. And maybe that's why some of us would like to see what a feminist UN Secretary General would do differently in this regards, because, we would have expected that, this is something that the UN Secretary General can just sign off on. But I think the political will to do that is not really there. It might be easy for him to think maybe young people will not give the UN more trouble like civil society would do. But for me, I do think that when we have a feminist Secretary General, things will and should be different because of the level of experience or lived experience they may have had in terms of inclusion, and also in terms of participation as it is needed in development or governance mechanisms such as the UN. Again, we continue to push. Hopefully, before the UN Secretary General leaves office, we're able to get him to appoint someone as the envoy. But again, it speaks to many of the issues that we're talking about. I like how President Obama puts it, said civil society can be a pain in the neck sometimes, but it's a must-have. All right, so how to move from that being a pain in the neck to the must-have is what we are now seeing the Secretary General not demonstrating. And we do hope the new leadership will be able to demonstrate that.
Great, thank you. And I think, Jesselina, you had your hand up, and that was your cue, I think you needed to come in, definitely.
Thanks, Ines. Just wanted to add also some of my perspective on the Summit of the Future, the UN Envoy, the Unmute Civil Society Initiative, and then perhaps move on to the 1 for 8 billion campaign. So just because Civica sort of wears hats on different campaigns. On the envoy, it was interesting that a bunch of us were working with member states, as OABC mentioned. As part of the drafting of the Pact for the Future, Costa Rica had put the UN envoy as part of the negotiations into the draft, but it never made it through. There were multiple rounds of reviews of the Pact for the Future, and at the end of the day, we did not see the envoy. We did not see the word human rights defenders. It's turned into a watered down term. Individuals with who support human rights and defend human rights. There's a lot of politics that goes behind these negotiations, and as my colleagues have mentioned, we're not part of these negotiations. We only get the draft from sort of friendly member states when they share it via WhatsApp, via email, and that's when we really get to see what's going on inside the rooms, which is an unfortunate reality. And even at the meeting for civil society organizations in Nairobi, initially when we were meeting with member states here in New York, the conversation was more so, around, well, this is a meeting for civil society organizations. We're not sure if member states are going to go for that. And some of the important push that a lot of colleagues did here in New York was to say, well, if you don't go there, what is civil society going to do? Just having a conversation amongst each other, how is that going to translate into actual policy? So I think it was really important for the co-facilitators to be there, and we did see some important language into the draft. Civicus was able to put in language on civic space, protection of civic space, and we've seen that in both the Pact for the Future as well as the Global Digital Compact, even though as not as strong as we would like to hope in the Global Digital Compact. And similarly, as my colleague Rebecca mentioned, we've seen some initiation around language on Security Council reform, on veto power, things that maybe 20 years ago it was unheard of to even have these conversations as part of large scale policy documents as part of the UN. But just coming to where we are in terms of the 1.8 billion campaign, we really did use the Summit of the Future and the UNGA this time to launch the policy platform. So we had a conversation with current representatives of governments as well as past representatives of governments. We had Ambassador Chan from Costa Rica. We had the previous Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, who also stood for the SG sort of nomination election process, or the appointment process, I would say, back in 2016. And we really had this important conversation while we were putting forward our policies of them coming together and saying that, we need change and we need to mobilize friendly member states. We need to mobilize civil society actors to really get what we want from this particular campaign. And we are seeing some sort of movement in terms of how member states have also been reacting. We saw a few member states as part of their General Assembly speech talk about a woman Secretary General. We've seen that Brazil in their G20 communication has also put forward language on supporting the election, the nomination of a woman Secretary General nominee from the Latin America sort of hub. We're also seeing South Africa respond positively to it. So we are sort of seeing that push, but it does require more civil society organizations to come together. And that is what we're hoping to do in the next step for the 1.8 billion campaign. Is also, we have 5 steering committee members, a third of whom are Global South positioned organizations, to have then regional hubs of how we coordinate with civil society organizations who are able to advocate for a woman Secretary General nominee, not just at the New York level, but more importantly at the national level, where the decisions are really made. And I would say that it's a task, but it's a very optimistic task, but it is it's an important one. And I really hope we're able to gather that sort of momentum, not just within civil society organizations, but across multi-stakeholder forums. Thank you.
Thank you, Giselina. And on behalf of those in our audience who are not very used to hearing about U.S. processes, and I just have a question about something that may sound very strange to someone who's really doesn't is not very close to how the UN works. This thing about including language on this, on that. I mean, what does it mean? And then how does that translate on actual change? I mean, what difference does a word make? And how does civil society work, just to follow up on those words? I think that's something that some people here would like to hear about.
I think that's a question that all of us ask ourselves. How do we, so when we talk about, let me start with, when we say change in language, when policies are being drafted, there are co-facilitators who sort of hold the pen to decide what language of words is used in the document. But it is a very member state driven process of how they come together in negotiation rooms and talk amongst each other of what words should be included and what words should not be included. So it's very interesting to see that process happen. And in terms of why language is important and how it's being trickled down, from my work as a lawyer in Nepal. I'm from Nepal and I worked as a human rights lawyer in Nepal. A lot of countries do rely, especially countries with newer democracies where constitutions and laws are gaining strength and momentum. There is a lot of reliance on what international law norms or what international law documents have in place. Judiciaries are quoting these documents. Parliamentarians are using it as part of the legislature body. So it is important for us to understand that, while words like protecting civic space might seem like a very small word as part of this large document. It can have a lot of impact when it translates to commitments and how we're able to hold governments accountable for the commitments that they're signing up to. So it is something important, not just in the New York level, but it translates to action back at the national level. And you know, it is always a top-down versus bottom-to-up approach of how we're integrating that process of once we get particular words in a document, how is that able to trickle down at the national level versus how are we able to take best practices from national level and really implement it at the international level. I think that's something important that we need to consider as well. But just wrapping up your question, so when we're talking about language, we're talking about specific words that are formulated and accepted as part of a policy document that forms then part of the larger sort of voting in the General Assembly when this particular resolution or pact is voted and accepted by member states. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you, Giselina. And yeah, please, Rebecca, go ahead.
Thank you. Just picking up on Giselina's excellent comments, to give an example, a case study, if you will, of the Pact for the Future and how this was iterated. We started this process. So first of all, the Summit of the Future was envisioned by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, and hailed as a once-in-a-generation opportunity for UN reform. It was originally supposed to be held in September 2023, tandem with the Sustainable Development Goals Summit, and they were decoupled due to the interventions of several states that were somewhat recalcitrant. In the long run, I think that decoupling was good because it gave everybody a longer on-ramp for the documents that would ultimately become disseminated by member states, and it also gave civil society that longer road. The original draft, the zero draft as it's called, was circulated by the co-focal points, the co-facilitators, in January of this year, 2024. And we went through 5 revisions before the ultimate Pact for the Future, which really was an 11th hour operation. We came down to the wire, not knowing if we would, after all of this, have a pact for the future, because a group of 7 states led by the Russian Federation led a movement to squash the pact if it applied within domestic jurisdictions as opposed to only at the international level, which would basically have neutered the whole thing and made it obsolete. And then the Congo and other states were prepared to respond to this, but an amendment was placed by the Congo and the pact went through, and we had a process of consensus rather than unanimity. And I think an important underscore, because in some UN entities, the two have almost become synonymous, and they are very much not. Consensus is not unanimity, and you will always have the outlying states. Now, throughout this process, I would say that civil society had a keyhole view. Normally, at least organizations, non-governmental organizations in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC status, in other words, would be able to at least observe negotiations from the gallery, if not participate, when a process like this was ongoing. But a decision was made very early on that that would not be the case. And so it was almost a game of telephone on who was getting information when. And thanks to some wonderful, wonderful folks at the Coalition for the UN We Need, I have to shout out to them, and Democracy Without Borders, you also did a whole lot to convene folks. We were able to try to find on the margins the ways in which to communicate with member states. Across the street from the UN headquarters in New York, we often convened with member states on a bilateral or multilateral basis thanks to the animation of those folks and some like-minded states. But the access to the process, I would say, was severely delimited. And I echo everything said about the worries leading up to the Nairobi Civil Society Summit. Also, on the Summit of the Future itself, there were 2 civil society action days that were directly before the summit. And while those were, I think, useful and productive, and my organization was one of many that held side events there was very real concern up to almost the 11th hour about the accreditation process, about visas. I live in DC, I'm from New York. It's not a problem for me to get to the UN. So many civil society actors from other regions were excluded from participating due to that fact. And now, I said that wasn't the end of the road. 2028 will be the big Summit of the Future review conference, but at annual intervals, we as civil society, I think, have a very important role to play in monitoring, not everybody likes that word, but looking after the implementation and working with states parties and showing them that, as was said earlier, that we can be helpful and not just a thorn in their side. That we don't want always to call out the bad actors. We're all in this, hopefully, for better governance, and hopefully that is our goal. We know that there are malactors, but one, again, hopes that they are the exception to the rule. So as we embark on this now process of leading up to 2028, I think we're going to look to the campaigns that were previously mentioned as really our lodestones to organize and galvanize around. And I can speak more specifically to the other campaigns, but I've gone on too long again, so.
Thank you, Rebecca. And we have Sigrid now and then Rodrigo.
Thank you so much. And I think this feeds exactly into what Rebecca was just talking about, because we've been speaking a lot about civil society, people, politicians coming into the UN. And I think one of the good things about the Summit of the Future was that the UN actually tried to come to its people. We can have many and long conversations about the quality of the inclusion of the Summit of the Future and the civil society meeting in Nairobi, but there was a civil society meeting on the African continent. And I think that is really, really important to highlight, because when we talk about accreditation, when we talk about funding, we also need to talk about that there is really not a proper representation of civil society when we actually get into the room at the UN in New York and at the UN in Geneva. And this is where the majority of the UN meetings are taking place. So I think what can really help restoring the trust in the UN as well is that the UN becomes better to meeting its citizens, and not just the other way around. And I hope the unmute manual can also go beyond New York, because this draft manual that we're drafting at the moment is focused on New York, and it makes sense because then we can do some really detailed recommendations. But our hope is that we can bring it beyond New York, and I think this national regional inclusion is very crucial. And obviously it can be difficult because coming back to COP29, the climate meeting in Azerbaijan, it was, civic space is almost non-existent there, and it was very, very limited opportunities for civil society to meaningfully engage. So it can be difficult for the UN to sort of travel around the world. But I do see a democratic point as well in the UN coming out of the big building in Manhattan as well. So it's a difficult conversation, I think, but we can never let it happen on the expense of civil society. So I think, and I hope that the Unmute Manual can be instrumental in this, and we're also working specifically on the climate conferences on having transparent host agreement, for example, between the UN and the host countries, so that we ensure that the human rights of participants attending the climate conference is really upheld. But I just think that it's important to think of the UN as an instrument and as a system that really needs to get out of their big halls as well.
Thank you, Sigrid and Rodrigo.
Yes, just to quickly sum to the conversation, as I see that we are running short on time. I think it's very worth to mention that besides the Pact for the Future that came from as a document of the United Nations Summit for the Future, before it and well ahead of the summit, the diverse group of more than 160 civil society organizations from all around the globe came in a joint open letter that aimed to support measures to enhance the democratization of global governance, and which included most of the proposals that were discussed in this webinar. This is the World Citizens Initiative, the United Nations Parliament Assembly, and the Envoy. And I think there are also the General Assemblies are also, the Citizens Assemblies are also included in the Pact of the People. That document was created and was given to United Nations member states to have into account when drafting during the summit of the future and drafting the Pact of the Future. After the document, the Pact of the Future does not include a single of the proposals made by the civil society organizations and well drafted before. And I think this is a very important a fact to mention, and also I think it's very illustrative of what are the main challenges that we face as civil society when trying to reform and trying to promote the democratization of global governance within the UN. And well, just as another point, as Rebecca mentioned, there was the idea that the Pact for the Future should be consensual, and this means that it should be approved by consensus. And this was a very much of an impediment, an obstacle, or a very much of a constraint when trying to promote democratizing reforms and democratizing proposals, and gives us a hint that consensus in this for this type of proposals, for these types of initiatives that we have mentioned here, it's impossible. I believe it is impossible, and that these proposals face that challenge that it will need to be correctly addressed through advocacy and negotiations. But just to give a quick recap to the war that we are facing, the geopolitical scenario is not very friendly to the world of democracy. Democracy does not appear too much in the Pact of the Future. In fact, I think if you search it, it only appears 6 times. And it also does not appear in the SDGs a single time. That is quite a remarkable fact. But I would finish my statement saying that this still does not mean that we should give up on democracy, and we should not give up on this hope. And there is still a lot of things that have been made, and I'm pretty sure that these proposals, as well, particularly talking also about the World Citizens Initiative, it's slowly but making some advances. It's slowly gathering support with member states. And I also speak the Parliament as Assembly has also been one of the priorities of Democracy Without Borders, and it's also good to highlight that there's also have been some small breakthroughs in the initiative and the proposal. So yeah, I think as well as we recognize the challenges and the difficulties that we have ahead, and that would put a lot of obstacles in these respective proposals, there is also some breakthroughs, some advances that have been made, and that keep up the hope, so to say.
Thank you, Rodrigo. It seems we don't have to lose hope in democracy at the UN level, but on democracy overall, right? Because we are seeing a regression of democracy all over the place. And this, some things that you have said and others have said before, I think they are pointing to the elephant in the room, which is that we are talking about democratizing this club that actually doesn't include, any clause about the democratic quality of their own members. So we are dealing with lots of states that are not democratic, and they don't respect civic space, and they actually reproduce restrictive practices within the UN, right? So maybe there are some things that we can learn from the EU, but there are some things that are more difficult to draw inspiration from and to reproduce at the global level, right? Imagine if we had a World Citizen Initiative, then many of us would enjoy, as members of the UN, rights that we don't really enjoy in our countries, that our governments that don't, we would be able to do things as citizens of the world that we're not able to do as citizens of our own countries, right? And this is a problem. The EU actually includes criteria for membership that are related to democratic institutions and respect for human rights, and look at the problems they are having with the countries within the EU that have experienced democratic regression. So if that's the problems that the EU is having, then I cannot imagine, the dimension of the problems we are looking at the UN level. So, but I don't want to end on a very sad note. And also, I hope we have questions from the audience that you can respond to, and you can raise our hopes with your responses. So let's see if anybody has a question. Diego, I don't think we are seeing questions, or I don't think we are able to see the chat, actually.
You could not see the chat?
I mean, I see a chat, but I think I can only write something for you. I cannot write like something for everybody. So I don't know if everybody else is seeing it.
I didn't receive questions, but if someone wants to do some question, could raise their hand. Otherwise, they could send me the question by chat, but I didn't receive until now.
Okay. So, in the meantime, and if there are no questions, I can ask you all again one very general question to wrap up, and you can say whatever you wanted to say and you didn't have time to say before. Basically, what would we need to prioritize? I mean, what are the next steps? What needs to happen next for to achieve progress? To actually make global governance more democratic, and specifically, all these different reforms. How must they all fit together? And is there anything else that we are missing that we should consider besides all these initiatives already on the table? So yeah, I mean, it's 3 questions. You can choose. You can answer any of those. Whoever wants to begin, please just go ahead.
I think for me, it would be in the level of work that needs to happen between now and when we have the next Secretary General, which would mean how do we cultivate friendly governments and also national governments to begin to see the need for more civil society engagement. But the realities of what we've seen on the floor of the United Nations is what we see locally as well. And it's part of the behaviors of our government at the national level on what meaningful civil society engagement would look like to them. So one is not really afraid or really surprised that we are seeing the shrinking of civil society participation at the UN. But we must set it as an agenda for the next Secretary General, while also as civil society organizations engaging with our national governments on the need for there to be that open space. I do know that there's another intergovernmental organization called the Community of Democracies that many of our governments, about 50 or 30 of them, have signed on to. We need to find ways of using these other intergovernmental processes to get the UN to be more open to civil society. I think we also need to do some level of house cleaning from the campaign on a parliamentary process within the UN to the campaign we are having now on having the UN being led by a woman to the Unmute campaign. We may need to find some cross-cutting themes that can help all of us to again set that agenda for whoever is leading the UN. But while at that as well is also to look at other processes within the UN that may be close to civil society participation, or where we have civil society participation and we can reinforce some of the best practices that we have there. I do also want to emphasize, and like I think it was Rodrigo that was saying, that we can't give up on democracy, even though we are seeing some level of democratic backsliding. And I would like to again reiterate the fact that yes, democracy can be slow, it can be painful, but it's all that we have. How do we again begin to reinforce the role of civil society in a democratic society, while also helping our leaders to understand that while we can be a pain in the neck, we do also have that important third sector role in what makes the economy run well, or in what makes democracy run well, or in what makes us also as citizens of whether a country or the global world, as it were.
Thank you, Oyebisi. Anybody else?
I can jump a bit and trying to also well, drift apart from the technicalities and well, the specificities of the things that we could do in I don't know, in technical or legal ways to promote well, this type of proposals or civil society organizations. I think that it's, and not to enter into that, I think it's to give more like a general answer. I think that the answer on how we democratize global governance lies in the very practice of democracy itself, right? Democracy usually rests, in my opinion, in principles such as representation, participation, deliberation, debate, accountability, or you know, inclusion. And so to advocate for democratic reforms in the global sphere, we should also first embody these principles in our actions. What am I trying to say? Well, this means that we should mobilize support for proposals that were like the ones mentioned here in this webinar, that offer a pathway to shape the global governance. It means that we should create spaces for dialogue, we should create spaces for debate, we should amplify the marginal voices that we are usually not often used to hear. We should, as civil society organizations, we should build coalitions that could go beyond normal and national borders and go beyond national topics or transcend sectors. So this is what I mean when we should embody also democracy, because I don't think it's just a set of principles, but it's more a practice, no? A continuous exercise of these principles of participation and deliberation and debate. And so by exercising these principles, we could also promote them into global governance, right? We could also mobilize our efforts. So we could also try to promote these proposals and to try to shift the path of global governance by creating a system that reflects the collective will of world human citizenship. And And at the same time, and this reminds me also of Rebecca's words at the beginning of this webinar, that she said that, well, the charter, the UN charter, should be a moving and changing document. Well, democracy should also be a changing and moving concept that will adapt, that will evolve, and that will meet the needs of a more interconnected and more globalized world. And I think that promoting democracy in the global context is also shows the resilience and the relevance of this concept nowadays. So yes, we should embody this democracy, and in trying to include it in what is global governance, and trying to include global governance in democracy, well, to promote. And so if we do it, we promote at the same time these type of initiatives. And I think it is very important that we do it as civil society organizations, but also as world citizens, as we all are.
Thank you, Rodrigo. We only have a few more minutes for Rebecca, Sigrid, and Cesalina to leave us some last words. Maybe Cesalina, you have your hand up. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thanks, Ines. Just wanted to take the opportunity to say thank you, but more so just want to, do a deep dive, but very brief deep dive of, I personally couldn't pinpoint exactly what is required for change, because, as we've seen even from today's conversation, if we just look at civic space, if we just look at civil society participation, there are so many ideas, so many beyond even the conversation that we're having today that require to be implemented to create that sort of fill of democratic deficit that we're seeing. But what I will say, and sort of leave my conversation there, is that we are seeing the appetite for change, whatever that may be. And I think that's important, because one thing that we also need to recognize is when the UN Charter came out in 1945, a third of the world was still under colonial rule at that time. So we also need to question, some of the structures that we are part of, that we are working under, and need to question how this can be sort of the way forward whenever we're talking about the appetite that we have in terms of change. There are some fabulous sort of new and innovative thinking approaches that are being taken forward here in New York. And one of the things, that we were discussing very recently is also around charter reform. What does charter reform even mean? If we're looking at reforming global governance, if we're looking at reforming the charter, is that a risky way to go forward? Do we, risk losing out on some of the gains that we've had in the past years? And I think that's important for us to consider. We've talked more so about the UN Security Council, but I will leave with saying that, there is a strong and growing appetite for change. And it is now that we need to put forward more forward-thinking proposals. We need to push the UN, and more so, I think, for the international community, we need to make sure that all of these ideas are never disjointed from work at the national level, at the regional level, because I think a lot of times what we're doing is we're looking at development practices in silo, reform practices in silo, and we need to recognize the strength of going forward from all different angles, all possible sort of entry points that we can. Thank you.
Yeah, Sigrid, please.
Thank you, and I will keep it very brief. I very much agree with Rodrigo on the point of realizing our potential as world citizens and ensuring the adequate mobilization among us and between us. These international alliances are super, super important. But we spoke a bit about the support from member states, and essentially what they claim, at least at the UN, is that it's a member state driven process. So I think especially just also reflecting on my own role as a Danish citizen, we in Global Focus have a huge responsibility in pushing our governments in taking this on. And I think what we need to let them know is also that this is not the democratic backsliding, the shrinking civic space. It's not something that just came out of nowhere. It's strategic. It's well funded. It's all over the place. So they need to amplify these messages over and over again. And we need to show that we're thousands and thousands of people, and that we have these very innovative and well thought through initiatives that they can really carry forward. And I think especially in the potential gap of the country where the UN headquarters is placed, potentially withdrawing from a lot of these places, I think there is a huge responsibility on a lot of member states to really step up at this moment, because I would say civil society is doing their part.
Thank you for the optimism of the will. I hope, Rebecca, you continue on that same path.
I have to. You have to laugh unless you cry in some of these instances. But no, speaking very practically, I think there's a tendency to think with all of these ideas on the table, wonderful notions, that there has to be a triage and there has to be an order behind them. And this has to come first and that has to come second. And really the beauty of coalition building is that's not the case. And that we can pat our head and rub our belly and we can work at different angles to look for those moments. I often say when it comes to coalition building and when it comes to advancing change at any level, there are the moments that we meet and there are the moments that we make. And here we have both of them. We have moments that we meet in terms the good, the bad, the ugly, from a summit of the future through dangerous backsliding and everything in between. And then there are those that we make ourselves because we have the right conversation at the right time. I'm reminded, I mentioned earlier, a very important, in my way of thinking at least, resolution on the veto power that led to a UN General Assembly debate that was introduced by Liechtenstein with a lot of support from civil society. That draft, this might be apocryphal, but I've been told, sat in the permanent representative's desk for 10 years until the perfect moment struck. And he could pull it out, and then it was accomplished and, may lead to down the road. Well, it has opened the door already to further charter reform discussions, further veto reform discussions. And the last thing, picking up on Sigrid's point a little bit about some of the headwinds that we'll be anticipating as global citizens who support global institutions. This is nothing new, and we unfortunately have weathered such before. In my country, we're familiar with this. I took on the role of co-convener of the Washington Working Group for the ICC the day that the previous sanctions were announced on that body. And we will be here and we will be calling for further UN support, despite how dark the times might look. And we know that we have allies across the globe through wonderful convocations like this. And that is very necessary for those of us who support democracy and global governance at this point. And let us also just not forget how outrageous, how quixotic the UN project might have seemed in 1945. In 1998, the launch of the International Criminal Court, or the signing of the Rome Statute, which led to the International Criminal Court taking effect in 2001. That was a group of 25 civil society organizations who coalesced in 1995 after decades, since actually the Second World War, of wondering, would there ever be an end to impunity for these crimes? And it happened. It was successful. And now that coalition is 2,300, I believe, members strong. So that gives me hope. And as I said, you have to have hope, because what is the alternative?
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the message of hope. And thank you all. Thank you, the five of you, for taking the time to share your incredible experience and expertise with us. We really appreciate this opportunity of learning with you. So thank you. Thank you. And have a nice afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for the invitation.